On LBC, they upload James O'Brien's whole show every single day. And because he gets a reasonable amount of views, and he's probably their most popular host on the channel. And it's very funny to me that the title that they've given for the first half of his show, because the second half is mostly about Charlie Kirk, it genuinely says, "Is this the point at which you conclude that Starmer's not very good at being Prime Minister?" You think, James? You think he might be bad at being Prime Minister? Wow. Mind blown, James. Mind absolutely blown. I'm very interested to find out how James has come to this conclusion in lieu of all of the evidence before now. Because I think most of us figured this out quite a while back. I mean, most of us thought he was going to be a terrible Prime Minister before the election, but then again, you didn't understand that he was a proven morally corrupt serial liar before the election, so here we are. But, like, his approval rating has been rock bottom for months, James. For months and months, right? And it's only the Mandelson stuff that gets you to think that he's the problem here? I'm interested to hear what James O'Brien is going to say here to enlighten us as to how he's changed his mind on Keir Starmer.
It's also worth noting that the unhappiness with Sir Keir Starmer over the Peter Mandelson story is not confined to what you might describe as the usual suspects or the traditional critics. Now, the left being what it is in this country, that doesn't just mean people on the right. The Judean People's Front, the People's Front of Judea, the factionalism within the...
Yeah, so the factionalism, where he is trying to describe it as two people with the same ideology but who have different factions, or one group of people with a completely different ideology to the other. The fact that he's saying, oh, well, the left have such a circular firing squad, as if, yeah, we dislike it when our government arms genocides or pushes disabled people into poverty, oversees a continual drop in living standards for the bottom 10% of households in this country, and removes rights from trans people so much that we become on par with Belarus and Hungary. Do you think that Keir Starmer's social policy should be the same as Orban's or Lukashenko's, James? Because if not, then you're the Judean People's Front, apparently.
Movement and on the entire left in this country is historically heartbreaking and absolutely visible from space. You put two Labour activists in... actually, I haven't got a very good joke here. I was trying to do a variation on the starting a fight in an empty room thing. You put your average left-winger is capable in this country, I don't know whether this includes me, of starting a fight in an empty room. You put three...
Well, that's because you're lumping in liberals and socialists into the same left-wing bubble, when one of those groups is very much not left-wing. It's a democratic socialist party, at least in theory, and yet democratic socialist politics is seemingly completely removed from Labour Party prescriptions for policy. I wonder if he will point the finger at the factionalism on the right of the party, given that that's where it's all really coming from. It was the right wing of the party that staged a coup by lying to the membership. It was the right wing of the party that refused to listen to the left-wing leader at the time and tried to stage an internal process to get rid of him, even though the overwhelming majority of members wanted him there. It was the right wing of the party, once they had party power, are having hoodwinked the membership, then purged the membership of left-wingers and said, if you don't like the changes, you can leave. And then people on the centre are trying to say, well, how come the leftists won't just get on board with the Labour Party? I'm like, it was clear that Labour didn't want us there. It was very, very clear, James.
Leftists in the same room in the United Kingdom, and you will have three different parties or three different factions by lunchtime. But none of that changes the fact that the criticism this time round will be and is coming from people who would previously have been considered loyal. How many MPs do you think have left the government since the election, which was in July, if you need a little memory jog, of 2024? And I'll tell you what, this tinder is so dry. These attack lines are so potent that even Kemi Badenoch could score some significant, some palpable hits at PMQs.
I mean, he's not wrong. It was very funny. It was like seeing a fish out of water. Ooh, Kemi Badenoch's actually being effective at PMQs. Wow, I'm shocked. I didn't know who this person was before. Turns out she's the leader of the opposition.
On Wednesday. Would you be able to name them all? Would you be able to actually go back to the beginning and name all of them, let alone count all of them? I don't know that I could. I think the one that I would have forgotten would have been the one that was a resignation on principle. So if you gave me a bit of help, actually there's been 2 resignations on principle, hasn't there? So you've got Louise Haigh having a fraud offence in her background, pleading guilty to a fraud offence, which she hadn't known about. She was sort of ordered to resign by Number 10 for a possible breach of the ministerial code. He didn't even bother referring that to his...
I wonder if James O'Brien is going to call out the culprit in terms of people like Louise Haigh being forced to resign. Again, from the soft left of the party rather than the right wing. Funny how this information made its way to the press. One would assume that it was someone who had access to compromat. Like, for example, Morgan McSweeney, whose first job as part of the Labour Party was to help Peter Mandelson run Excalibur, which was their whole compromat machine during the New Labour era. I wonder if he might be able to put 2 and 2 together, that for some reason it's people in a certain faction of the party who are getting things leaked to the press. I wonder if he'll recognise that.
His independent advisor. Then you had Tulip Sadiq, accused in another country of, if you like, corruption, and it was the allegations being brought particularly against her aunt, the ousted Prime Minister of Bangladesh, that were considered to be harming the government. So she didn't break any rules, according to an investigation, but she should have been more alive to the reputational risks. So she walked away, saying she would have been a distraction from the work of government. I don't think you can blame Keir Starmer for either of those. Do you?
Well, yes, it is Keir Starmer's fault, James, because Keir Starmer is the one who is the brainchild of Morgan McSweeney's project to hoodwink the party back to the right. And Starmer isn't the one making the decisions. And it's McSweeney who was the one who, in my opinion, was likely to have leaked this to the press to get rid of people from the left of the party, such as Lou Haigh. In the words of Matt Zarb-Cousin, yes, I'm going to bring up the tweet, yet again, Keir Starmer, as Prime Minister, is like one of those children sitting in a coin-operated car outside a supermarket. It's moving backwards and forwards, and he's gleefully turning the wheel, but it's somebody else in total control.
You've got Andrew Gwynn suspended as from the party after it emerged that he had sent messages in which he said he hoped a pensioner who did not support him would die before the next set of elections. He'd also been racist and sexist about Angela Rayner and Diane Abbott, which probably would have got him a promotion in Boris Johnson's Tory party, but in Keir Starmer's Labour Party, it's hit the road time. And then you've got Annalise Dodds and Vicky Foxcroft, who resigned on points of principle, which still exist. The International Development Minister quit over the decision to halve the international aid budget to pay for an increase in spending on defence, and Vicky Foxcroft quit as a whip for because she couldn't support the government's welfare plans. She'd been a shadow disability minister before the general election.
Okay, so that's another thing where she's had to resign because she disagreed with a bunch of welfare cuts that Morgan McSweeney wanted them to have, so they could become more like Blue Labour to try and win over reform voters that are never going to vote for them anyway, and that nobody in the party wanted and they had no mandate to put in, and that everybody hated, and that they had to U-turn on at the last minute because even the backbenchers hated it. They couldn't even convince the PLP, and the fact that the PLP humiliated Starmer by forcing him to U-turn on this shows you again that this is his fault. Morgan McSweeney was the one who wanted the reforms, Starmer allowed him to be in the position to push for it, and the PLP said no. Fully Starmer's fault.
You've got to take your hat off to those two, whether you agree with their decision or not. Acting entirely on principle in the crucible of political ambition is an unfamiliar and admirable thing. Rushanara Ali, the homelessness minister, who she didn't actually make anybody homeless, but she left herself open to Kemi Badenoch.
She evicted a fucking family, James.
telling that lie in the Commons on Wednesday, but she did, of course, tell people to move out of the home that she rented or to stay there on notice that she was trying to sell it. And then when they left and she failed to sell it, it went back on the rental market at an increased price. Again, I don't think you can blame Keir Starmer for that, and I don't really think you can blame him for Angela Rayner failing to get the proper advice that she needed to purchase her home in Hove. How many homes do you think Angela...
I think you absolutely can blame Keir Starmer for this, James. He appointed a landlord as the homelessness minister. What kind of fucking clown human appoints a landlord to the position to look after the problem caused by landlords? Honestly, yes, that is Keir Starmer's fault. I don't care whether she's a good landlord or a bad landlord. You shouldn't have a landlord as homelessness minister, or as any minister in a Labour government. Heaven fucking forfend.
The relationship between the politics and the public is not a science. Perception is absolutely crucial. I heard some fascinating vox pops elsewhere this morning, which focused... One of them was really talking about charisma and how the departure of Angela Rayner had denied the front bench of charisma and of a good orator. And I thought, I'm a big fan of oratory, but I would have thought that we'd had enough of, quotes, charisma, end quotes, in this country. It kind of brought us Brexit and it brought us Boris Johnson. I don't think anyone's ever accused Liz Truss of being charismatic, but she came in on the coattails of movements that sort of prioritised vibes and feelings over facts and expertise. But, you know, you've got to take that on board. It goes, doesn't it? It's the idea that you need someone. There's a great phrase that's knocking around at the moment. You've probably heard me use it as well, although I nicked it. So you need to tell a story. They haven't got a story to tell. And I think that accusation lands very heavily on Keir.
Well, yeah, it's because they don't believe in anything. That's the biggest problem with Keir Starmer and the Politburo and everybody there who's engaging in triangulation politics, is that fundamentally they believe in absolutely nothing. They believe in fuck all. They believe in getting into power and then being the ones in power and then doing whatever is necessary in their own minds to maintain that, even though, hilariously, they seem to find it very difficult to actually remain in power when they do, as we've seen from Keir Starmer's record low approval ratings. You can't fundamentally build a story about who you're supporting, what your interests are, if fundamentally you will say anything to anyone if you believe it's going to be electorally viable.
Starmer at the moment. I can't believe he has got himself into this mess, and it is incredibly early in his premiership for me to be asking you how much damage he has suffered from...
Can't believe how he got into this mess by being somebody who was very good friends with everybody from New Labour, who was essentially coached into being Prime Minister by a New Labour fixer in the form of Morgan McSweeney, having good friendships with a bunch of other people from New Labour like Tony Blair and the Tony Blair Institute, and then inputting a bunch of people as MPs, having fixed selections so that it looked even more like New Labour and was full of Blairites. And Morgan McSweeney, his chief of staff, also had a really good relationship with Peter Mandelson, a Blairite. And you wonder how a bunch of Blairite bigwigs are in positions of power, and how somebody who was a big purveyor of compromat in the 2000s is now back with compromat over Keir Starmer to get him appointed in the first place. Like, you've not been paying attention, James. You do a live show 5 days a week where you comment on politics, and at no point have you looked at the makeup of the current front bench, of the current staff that Keir Starmer surrounds himself with and has surrounded himself with for the last 5 years. And you've gone, oh, awful lot of Blairites about. Awful lot of people with skeletons in the closet about. Yeah, they've been there since day one. Mandelson was an advisor for Keir Starmer for ages. Jim Pickard from the Financial Times asked him about his relationship with Peter Mandelson before the election. Maybe it was worth, at some point, before we had no choice but to have Keir Starmer to be Prime Minister for 5 years, potentially, to have questioned his links to people like McSweeney and Mandelson before the election, James. But you were too busy wondering about why would it be so bad for there to be an unassailable majority for Labour? Here you go, right? Here's your evidence. Supermajority for Labour. not working out particularly well now, isn't it? Because there's basically no leverage to change the direction, given what the makeup of the PLP looks like right now. Well done. So many of us told you what would happen, and it has happened. It literally, as was pointed out by somebody in Twitch chat, how can I, as someone with a phone camera and a ring light, be far more politically astute over the reality of what this would be like from day one, given that I was saying this would happen from before the election, and James O'Brien was blissfully unaware before now? How am I the one making the good takes? In fact, scratch having a phone camera and a ring light. People with Simpsons avatars and made-up names on Twitter have more political acumen in terms of determining what Labour would be like in government than James O'Brien. You want to really know what it's going to be like for the next 4 years? Why don't you ask Honourable Pol Prof of Agile Ceremonies or Bortoism? Maybe they'll tell you far more interesting facts about the reality of Labour in government than professional political commentator James O'Brien.
All of the things that we've just talked about, and then from the policy decisions, including the winter fuel debacle and others, but crucially, and I think uniquely, putting Peter Mandelson in the embassy in Washington when it was known that Mandelson had stayed friends with Jeffrey Epstein after his first child sex conviction. And to make things even worse, Mandelson's people are now briefing journalists that he told the Prime Minister that he'd continued his relationship with the financier for many years and deeply regretted doing so. I mean, I don't know if there's much point speculating on how this happened for too long, but I think we can allow ourselves a moment or two. I'm trying to imagine the conversation. And I mean, Mandelson is a brilliant communicator. He's an even better communications advisor, of course, although the firm that he set up...
I mean, clearly he isn't. If he was having all of this influence over Keir Starmer in the position to get put into the ambassadorial role, the marquee ambassadorial role, i.e. the one for the United States, clearly he isn't. Because look at what's happening with the Labour Party. Look at how popular they are. Yes, true, Alistair Campbell was saying it's a real problem. I was saying it as soon as he was appointed. We were saying it before the election. So was Jim Pickard from the Financial Times. Where were you, James? Where were you?
Up with one of his former factotums is currently severing its ties. I think his share in the firm is up for sale. But he gets it. I've told you stories in the past that people have shared with me about the micromanagement of detail when it comes to presentation. So in that room with Keir Starmer, I imagine that he just kept hitting the regret button. I imagine that he made the whole conversation feel like an expression of regret.
Still not mentioned Morgan McSweeney here. He's the key broker that pushed Keir Starmer to do the appointment. Keir Starmer was the one with reservations. It was McSweeney who put him through. A Carmen Idol in YouTube chat. I was a Labour councillor until 2 weeks ago. Now independent. It's no better in local government. They're all over the place. Messy, full of big egos. Yep, I've heard many similar things. There are other former Labour councillors who frequent my chat too who say identical things. In fact, we spoke with a former Labour councillor turned Green Party MP candidate, Shaman Rahman, and she pointed out that the biggest change that she felt when moving from Labour to the Greens was an enormous sense of relief that she felt like that there was a political party that actually wanted her there, rather than thinking that she was somehow a liability or that her existence was tedious and needed to be managed, because essentially all that she was there for under Labour was to campaign and to give membership subs and then to do what the Central Committee asked her to.
I did stay friends with him, but I regret it so much. I've regretted it so much since. And I can't quite get my head around how Starmer let that go. I honestly find myself today thinking, for the first time, that Keir Starmer just isn't very good at this stuff. I completely reserve the right to reverse ferret on this and to say that's more...
Like a on, James. Like, you're only just criticising him now, after all of this time when he's shown himself to be just a terrible leader in pretty much every sense of the word. Like, rather than bringing people together, he's a control freak that turns people away from him. He's got the record low approval ratings for a new prime minister this short into their term in government, basically ever. He's pissed off every sector of society, and his policy platform is landing with nobody, even though there are at least some policies people actually poll to say they like. They just don't like it more than they hate everything else. On top of being somebody who's wooden, who essentially only wants to be prime minister, who isn't in control of any of his own direction as prime minister, and who fundamentally is only where he is because of lies. And you're like, maybe just now, maybe he's not very good. But I reserve the right to retract that if he turns out to actually be good. The rest of us have made our mind up, James. So much of these last 5 years has been a litany of failure on the part of Keir Starmer that was tempered by the fact that the Tories were just way worse at it, rather than him being actually good. And the only reason why people fawn over him is because A, he's not Corbyn, so he won't put up their taxes, and B, he's not Johnson, so he's not floppy hair Brexit bad man. And that's essentially all that mattered to them, was the optics of who he represented politically, without actually bothering to scrutinise, is he actually any good at politics, which obviously he's not. Phil Morehouse still thinks that Mandelson appointment was fine and a stroke of genius even now. There's no helping some people. We literally had a well-liked and storied historic ambassador to the United States who'd been in post for 6 years. She was liked by the Republicans, by the Democrats, by Trump's own deputy campaign manager. There was quite literally an ambassador already in place who was doing her job very, very well. You didn't have to put fucking Peter Mandelson there. But of course, again, the Keir Starmer isn't the one in control. It's the Politburo of the Blairites.
Like it at some point in the future, but this story, more than any other, more than all the others, it just feels like such an easily avoidable mess. Do you remember what my friend Scott said about the Angela Rayner story? He said there is a requirement to ask at every turn whether or not this could possibly come back to bite you on the backside. And as a former director of public prosecutions who has done more than almost anybody else alive to address particularly the abuse of young women in this country, and indeed up to and including the so-called grooming gangs, how could he possibly not have thought that a deep and abiding association with a known paedophile after the first conviction had been secured would not come back to bite them all on the backside? I genuinely, it's one of those things that seems to me to get bigger the more you talk about it. Sometimes with this stuff, particularly because we're all sort of enthralled to right-wing media talking points in this country, and I do my best, of course, to break that cycle. But the more you talk about some stories, the smaller they sometimes feel. The Angela Rayner story, oddly, was much smaller than the headline suggested. Big enough for a resignation, but for an honest mistake that was adjudged by the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Standards, who described it as such. So there was no...
I mean, he is not wrong here. The Angela Rayner scandal is, quite frankly, small fry. I obviously kind of pithily compared it to like the Stephen Milligan drama from the 1990s, right? There's all in very different kind of universes of what is or is not a scandal, right? It was hypocrisy, it did break the ministerial code and she was right to resign. But in terms of the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't really that bad what Angela Rayner did. You compare it to appointing somebody who stayed friends with one of the most notorious sex traffickers in the history of the world after he was convicted the first time? I'm sorry, like, no one can defend this. It's completely indefensible. But again, why did you not scrutinise this at the time, James? 6 months in the making. It was January he was appointed. So 9 months in the making, even. Scrutinise the kind of people that he was hanging around with even before the election.
Particular act of egregious idiocy or corruption. So the more you talked about that, the smaller the story got, even as you reached the point where you realised that her departure was probably inevitable and indeed necessary. And this story here, Lord Mandelson admitted in his vetting interview for the role of US ambassador that he continued his relationship with the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein for many years, allies said last night, as Sir Keir Starmer faced questions about his judgment from cabinet ministers. This seems to me to be huge. Is it? Does it look that way to you? I mean, of all the things that you're going to give a free pass to, or look the other way, or gamble won't come out, or gamble won't matter. Think about the way in which Epstein was dominating debate. Oddly enough, Charlie Kirk, I learned yesterday, was a huge advocate for the release of the Epstein papers. I think until Donald Trump got into the White House, an awful lot of Donald Trump allies absolutely adamant that the Epstein files or the Epstein story was being covered up and that Donald Trump would be the man to blow the lid off it. And then Donald Trump, one of Jeffrey Epstein's oldest and dearest friends, got into the White House, and suddenly some of them went quiet and some of them stuck to the story. So the idea that Keir Starmer thought this might go away, I just think this is. I think that's the line. Actually, we don't need to get hyperbolic about it, and we don't need to get personal even necessarily. Is this the point at which you think, do you know what? He might have been able to carry a Ming vase across an ice rink. One departure of a senior ally may be considered unfortunate, but two in a week, that's worse than careless. Is this the point at which you start wondering whether, or you start concluding that he's not actually very good at this?
It's interesting that he talks back to the analogy of carrying a Ming vase across an ice rink, right? That was how people described the run-up to the general election in 2024. I think people used this specific analogy because they assumed that Labour's poll could theoretically tank, as obviously it has done post-election. But of course, that was in response to policy that they did in government. The issue, of course, is that the Ming vase was a description that, well, they might pull out a 1992-style loss in the way that Kinnock did, but that was just never going to happen. The Ming vase strategy was essentially a way of people like James O'Brien railroad people into voting for a Starmer government that they didn't really want, just to get rid of the Tories, given that Keir Starmer had essentially knocked out a bunch of the left-wing policy that people actually wanted, like me, that caused me to leave the party, right? That was his line. And what it means is that anything that happened pre-election can be post hoc justified by the needs to win the election, regardless of whether or not it would have actually affected the overall outcome. So all of the impropriety of Starmer pre-election, we can forget about it. We don't need to talk about it. That was the Ming vase strategy. It was all justified. It was justified to lie to the left. It was justified to excise the left. It was justified to not bother talking about the inevitable tax rises. And it was justified to hide a bunch of the policy prescriptions that they had coming down the line that they knew the public wouldn't like, right? All of that was fundamentally justified by the Ming vase strategy, when in reality, no, it wasn't. These were all bad things. They were all emblematic of Keir Starmer's failure as leader, and essentially the necessity of people like Starmer to lie, both to get into the leadership and to get into government. So much so that, of course, it's understandable that people hate him now. He has no mandate for a bunch of the stuff that he's doing, because he's doing it based upon their majority in the Commons of a manifesto that's basically empty. And that's why it's super interesting that he's comparing these two things together. Because again, if you had bothered scrutinising Keir Starmer before the election in 2024, without fearing for shattering the Ming vase, by doing your due diligence as a journalist, then you would have realised ages ago that Keir Starmer is really bad at this. He was picked because they knew that they could control him over at Labour Together. They knew that he would do what they wanted to do over at the Labour Together Politburo, right? That was fundamentally the reason why he was picked, and he seemed prime ministerial, and Keir Starmer's only drive was to become prime minister, to be able to tick that off on the bucket list. It was the perfect storm for terrible governance. And again, you would know this, James, if you'd bothered scrutinising any of his political actions before now, but you haven't, so you're here again in your role, in your remit, as a fully paid up, daily professional political commentator, being completely unaware of Keir Starmer's multiple different character flaws until now. That's fundamentally the reason why that we're here. Because if you were doing your job, you would have known. The problem is that people continue to go off the brand rather than the reality, trying to convince my boomer parents that Labour isn't the labour of their youth, is an exercise in futility. They just answer with, but you're allowing reform in if you support the Greens. It used to be you're allowing the Tories in, but they can't see that the result has been years of the country going to the right. Exactly, you're fundamentally right, Maureen. That has always been the problem. And that's interesting. You obviously talk about people looking at the name rather than the reality or the brand. Remember when we looked at this, the FT had put up this collation of how people perceived the parties to be ideologically based upon who was leader, right? And so the Tories were seen to be very centrist under David Cameron and very right-wing under Boris Johnson, when the reality is totally the opposite. Like, David Cameron is the most right-wing prime minister that we have had since Thatcher was removed. Maybe he was less right-wing than John Major because he privatised like the railways and stuff, but it's different shades of shit at this point. They're both very right-wing, right? The austerity programme was one of the most right-wing things this country has ever done because it was so brutally targeted at the poorest in society. It was so fundamentally regressive in its whole nature as well, given where they put the tax rises too, by getting rid of the 50p rate, putting up VAT. So David Cameron's government was astronomically right-wing, one of the most right-wing governments we ever had. But Boris Johnson was considered to be right-wing because he was perceived to be like an English nationalist. Like, maybe that's kind of partially true, but when you look at economic policy and even some social policy, like he was wanting to do things to do action on the climate, he wanted to invest in the NHS, he wanted to build hospitals, he wanted to complete Northern Powerhouse Railway that George Osborne had left in the dirt. Like, there were loads of things that he did that involved spending more money, and he did spend more money. He did spend money. The NHS increased its overall expenditure by way more than it had ever done under Osborne or Hammond, at the time of Johnson and Sunak being Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? To do a full ban on conversion therapy, including trans people, right? Boris Johnson was very kind of socially liberal in these regards. And all of that didn't matter because he was floppy hair Brexit bad man, and that's the brand that he represented. And similarly, in this same graph that we saw, people perceived Keir Starmer to be more left-wing, or the Labour Party to be more left-wing under Keir Starmer than it was under Miliband or Brown, right? And partially, this was fundamentally because of the fact that people perceive Labour to be very left-wing just because there was a period in which Jeremy Corbyn was leader, which was significantly different from any other leader that there has been essentially since John Smith. But because there was a Corbyn brand still associated with Labour, even though Keir Starmer had fundamentally shifted it way to the right on loads of different issues, it didn't matter, because it was the perception that was relevant rather than Keir Starmer's actual policy prescriptions. Yeah, Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister was very right-wing, kind of fashion to David Cameron, but less socially liberal than Cameron was. But fundamentally, the most left-wing Conservative Prime Minister that there's been, probably since Macmillan, maybe, is Boris Johnson. Maybe Heath is more to the left than Johnson was, but Johnson was certainly more left-wing than May, Cameron, Major and Thatcher. Boris Johnson stood out because he was a conservative and not a die-hard Thatcherite, unlike the rest of the party. Well, that was funny, and that Boris Johnson was actually quite socially liberal, but fiscally he was very interventionist, which isn't very liberal in economics, right? Like, he was kind of like an old-school conservative in that kind of regard.
I mean, there is stuff that he is good at, but the bits you need to be good at to win elections or to sustain support of on the scale that he secured last July, he's not actually very good at. Or is it even worse than that? You're going to make an ambassadorial appointment despite known links to a known paedophile, and it already being known that he stayed at the financier's townhouse. He stayed at the paedophile's townhouse while the paedophile was in jail. Surely that is the point at which you conclude that this bloke has no business in your administration whatsoever. Anyway, I mean, there is another argument, but I thought I'd leave it to you to make that, which is that two things can be true at the same time. He has done a really, really good job as ambassador, and Starmer's gamble was that that would outweigh the possibility of the problems that have popped up now.
I really don't think that there is any truth to this idea that somehow our relationship between the UK and the United States that has kind of been better than it has been between the United States and Europe, for example, is due to Peter Mandelson being a really good ambassador. I do not fundamentally think that that's true for 1 second, especially given the fact that we had a well-liked ambassador who was doing a good job before Mandelson somehow made it in when he was so close to the Starmer Politburo at the time, right? I fundamentally don't buy the linchpin of the cordial relationship between Starmer and Trump is specifically Peter Mandelson, even though him and Trump share the Epstein link. I think that that is far more to do with the long-term desire of the United States to break Britain away from the EU and wanting to have us as a vassal state. That was part of Pete Navarro's and Scott Bessent's plan for their aggressive use of tariffs to be able to reshape the world geopolitically, is to divide the world between adversaries, states, and people who were somehow in a sphere of influence. And whilst the EU was part of the sphere of influence, the UK was the vassal state. There was always going to be a close relationship based upon the Navarro and Bessent plan for the use of tariffs that meant that we would get further distanced from the European Union due to our close relationship with the United States that was courted by people like Navarro, or at least through policy. I don't think Peter Mandelson has anything to do with this, because fundamentally, the UK doesn't have any power in this relationship. Fundamentally, if we want to be the United States' bitch, which is what we are, because we don't seem to want to have closer relationships with other countries around the world that aren't the United States, at least not within the remit of which that is outside of the oversight of the United States. It's perfectly amenable to the people in charge of the US who see us as a future vassal state in their reshaping of global politics using aggressive trade policy. So whether you have Mandelson or the old ambassador, our relationship with the United States was never going to be that different. If you want to understand the Navarro-Bessent plan to reshape global politics via trade negotiations, you should watch the Money and Macro video about the tariff policy. It was very illuminating to me. Yeah, the fact that politically, the only member of the royal family who's as hated even more than Harry and Meghan are, who are fundamentally hated for wanting to extricate themselves from the royal family, is Prince Andrew, who was desperate to stay part of the royal family because of the history that he has with Epstein. He managed to piss off even the royalists who seem to take every single royal and refuse to critique them outside of Prince Andrew and make them hate him. That's how bad Prince Andrew was due to his relationship with Epstein, right? That's how negatively polarizing a relationship with Epstein will make you. And he still appointed him the ambassador. It's almost like this wasn't a decision that was made by Starmer, you think?
But that's the point, isn't it? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need to tell me how big is this? And again, as with the Angela Rayner stuff, if you've hated Peter Mandelson and Keir Starmer since you were born, then your position, your opinion isn't going to be quite as interesting as the views and opinions of people who have been a little bit more open-minded. How big a problem is this? And do you think Starmer is now irreparably damaged? I can't believe I'm asking that question in September of 2025 when he only got into Downing Street in July of 2024. And I can't believe I'm asking it about someone who is demonstrably not corrupt in the way that Boris Johnson was, or ridiculous in the way that Liz.
You say that Keir Starmer isn't corrupt? We literally had an entire season of questioning over the financial relationship between rich people and the cabinet. Do you want me to bring up the emails between Jonathan Reynolds and BlackRock? Shall we bring up the donation from Quadrature Capital? Shall we think about the relationship between Rachel Reeves and the Green Finance Institute, right? These are corrupt individuals. You are, quite frankly, doing a disservice to your listeners, James, when you refuse to scrutinise these obviously corrupt links between very powerful people and institutions and the people at the top of the Labour Party, because fundamentally you see them as the good guys, so you refuse to critique it unless it's impossible to ignore, like the Mandelson and Epstein stuff. Corrupt as Johnson, obviously not, but why is Boris Johnson the bar? Why would I understood who they were earlier than you be a disqualifying factor? Well, because again, James O'Brien doesn't want to be proved wrong. It's as simple as that. He doesn't want to be proved wrong, which would be difficult for him, given the fact that he literally wrote a book called How to Be Right, when, of course, James O'Brien seems to fail very, very frequently at that very singular thing that he professes to be an expert on.
Was, or dangerous in the way that Nigel Farage is. He's none of those things. But that doesn't mean he hasn't suffered irreparable damage. How big is this problem? And contingent, I suppose, upon your answer to that question, how damaged is he?
He should resign. Absolutely resign. He does not have the confidence of the public. He barely has the confidence of his own MPs, all 400 of them. And this is a man who we are trying to entrust a very, very fragile geopolitical world, who is so incompetent at picking his chiefs of staff and picking people for very, very high-profile roles in government. He knowingly appointed somebody with a very strong relationship to the world's most famous sex trafficker in history. Does that scream the kind of competence necessary to lead an entire country, James? Answers on a postcard. But he should go. He should absolutely resign.
Thoughtful answers only, please, on 03456060973. Okay, Patrick's in Glasgow. Patrick, what would you like to say?
Oh my god, this is too good! This is too good, chat! Oh my god, this is the perfect time for me to just randomly browse Twitter and see this, right? This is the perfect time. I hate the press in this country, but sometimes they just know. They just know when to drip the information out to cause maximum embarrassment for the politicians. Number 10 were passed the Mandelson Epstein emails the day before Keir Starmer backed him at Prime Minister's questions. So the thing that they are telling the country was the reason for them changing course and actually removing Peter Mandelson as ambassador is something that they knew when they were defending him the previous day. So they were literally telling the public, we have full confidence in him, we think that he's okay. And then the next day it was published that Tim Mandelson essentially defended Jeffrey Epstein in emails to Epstein after he had been convicted of child sex crimes. They knew this information and still defended him. And then it was released publicly the next day. Then they changed course and sacked him. Indefensible. Totally indefensible. Do you want to know, James? Are the administration permanently damaged by Keir Starmer? Yes. Is this the end? Yes. Will Keir Starmer eventually resign at some point? Yes. But hey, Starmer's not corrupt, though. Again, you have to compare it to the Chris Pincher stuff. It's so obvious. I have to tweet. but for all his faults, chat, no one thinks that Keir Starmer is a proven morally corrupt serial liar. This is so good. Oh, I miss when politics was this fun. It makes me feel so virile, chat. Watching Keir Starmer be miserable is so good. Mandelson therefore believes he was unfairly dismissed and won't go quietly. Still on the government payroll, he could walk away with a hefty taxpayer-funded payout unless ministers prove he misled them in what's being called a disastrous HR process. It's so good! It's theatre. It's absolute theatre. Trouble in paradise, eh, Keir? Trouble in paradise? I am fully banter timeline pilled. This chat, do you know what all of this, everything that's happened from 2020 up until now, right? Everything that's happened up until the point where Keir Starmer knowingly defended Mandelson even after he was passed emails showing that he was sympathetic to Epstein after being convicted of child sex crimes, right? You know what all of this is? Do you know what all of this is, chat? This is the adults in the room. This is the sensible centrists taking charge. No more student politics anymore, chat. Now it is only the grown-ups in charge of the Labour Party. And yes, he's got the whole weekend with the press cycle going on. He won't even be able to challenge it. Oh no, this is the best time. They've dropped it at like 10 p.m. on Friday night after everyone goes home to their oh my god. Oh. Finally, a Murdoch wrecking project that I can fully get behind. It's nice, isn't it, the quiet? It's nice, isn't it, the quiet? Is the difference between being sacked and resigning to do with pensions and future contract opportunities? I believe so, because he's been withdrawn. Like, he's not technically been sacked or have been forced to resign. He's been removed from his ambassadorial position. Of course, he is still a member of the House of Lords, so still on the public payroll regardless, right? But I believe internally, he is still on the payroll.
Hello, James.
Hello, Patrick.
I've spent the majority of the last 4 years or so thinking that Keir Starmer was I think quite like a lot of people who voted for him maybe for the first time or voted Labour last year. I'm a long-term Labour. I've been brought up to feel like, you know, public and taxation to spend for public services is a good thing. I up until maybe this I'm a bit like you. I think that this is something that will stick and is something that's so catastrophically badly managed by someone that does or did appear to be the manager.
I think we're in very similar places. It's as if this is the...
Someone just mentioned Morgan McSweeney. Please. Like, again, James, you're a professional political commentator. All of this is fundamentally downstream of Morgan McSweeney's control of the Labour Party, essentially entirely within his office. The Politburo that he commands are the ones that are at fault here. I've had this big thing, or maybe Starmer's not very good. He's not in control of this, James. He's the coin-operated car driver. They've sat him at the front of the Docklands Light Railway. That's what his own team members said about him. Angela Rayner famously apparently said that he couldn't even run a bath. And that's the reality here. And you spent this entire time talking, and you've not mentioned the central figure who's at blame here, which is Morgan McSweeney. There was literally a book on this. Yeah, exactly. There was the Starmer Project. There was even Get In by the people from the Times, Conrad and Maguire. Like, there's been multiple studies and exposés on the reality of the Politburo behind Starmer. You just not pay attention.
The sort of irrefutable evidence that being able to carry a Ming vase across an ice rink does not involve the same very specific set of skills that you need to do a good job when you've got the vase to safety. Managing I don't want to diminish him, because I do think deep down I think he's a decent chap and someone that has dragged Labour, you know, from the depths of despair into government. But managing the country, becoming Prime Minister, is very, very different. He did have the air of someone that and those first few weeks.
It is interesting, again, that just like James O'Brien, this caller is going, well, it was fine when he was lying to the left. It's fine when his misdeeds were directed at the left-wingers. But now the misdeeds and lies are directed at everybody else who actually matters. And that I will not stand for. That's just fundamentally what this caller's saying, which is what James O'Brien believes.
When he was appointing ministers, you thought, hang on, this is someone that knows what they do. The winter fuel payments.
That's the first massive wobble.
Was something that you said it. They wasted so much political capital on something so. And even now you look back and you think
how could they have done that? There is an argument that with better communications they could have sold it to more people, but even,
I mean, if they had better policy, if they'd just done what they've done now at the start, i.e. keep it universal but claw some of it back from those who don't need it via a tax taper. That was the policy that I proposed literally the day that it was announced and the day that people got mad about it. I said that back when this whole fucking kerfuffle started, and turns out it took them 6 months for them to listen to me.
And then thresholds and the number of people that were affected. It was quite an extraordinary act of self-harm, that, politically speaking. It really was. And those are the moments wherein you find yourself beginning to question the expedience theory, the pragmatist theory, the Ming Vase theory. This one, just to steer you back to it, it can't be quite as clear-cut as we think it is. It was such an obviously stupid thing to do, we can't believe he did it, because he wouldn't have done such an obviously stupid thing to do. He must have thought that the benefits of having Mandelson in post outweighed the risks. Now, that might make him an idiot, but it's not a position that can be completely ignored, given, and we mention it for the first time this morning, who is actually in the White House.
Exactly. I think obviously when he was appointed, maybe the US election hadn't happened, so it was maybe an appointment that, look, it looks like Trump's going to come back in. Let's kind of, you know, it just beggars belief really now, and the links with this, the emails. I know Labour ministers were a lot of them were talking about that. It's dirty, it's sleazy, and one thing you can't.
The Labour right? Dirty and sleazy? Guards! The Blairites have become dirty and sleazy. Remember, this is the people who are in charge during Cash for Honours and the expenses scandal. In fact, new Labour MPs were further implicated in the expenses scandal than Tories were. And this is exactly the thing that we criticise rightfully the Tories for doing. And yet, for some reason, when we have that same heuristic for criticism towards the Labour right, suddenly, like people like this caller and James suddenly sound all shocked. I did watch the Peeps interview with Corbyn, yeah.
Throw at Mr. Starmer so far is sleaze or thing, but this it leaves an awful taste, and I have friends who are way more left wing than me, and when Keir Starmer was announced leader, I thought I had that kind of self-satisfied smug of thinking, this might be the first step back for Labour. I grew up I was born in the late 80s. I grew up with a Blair government. I think, apart from Iraq, that Tony Blair was a good, and Gordon Brown.
It is very funny watching people who just kind of vote Labour by osmosis, who don't critically analyse the time they're in government, going, yeah, well, apart from Iraq, the Blair government was good. And I'm just like, you fucking don't know anything, mate. Was it better than the Tories? I mean, arguably, for plenty of different reasons, right? But then you just completely gloss over, 30-day detention. You gloss over PFIs. You gloss over the fucking shamble which was the league tables. You gloss over things like Afghanistan. You gloss over things like buy-to-let mortgages. You gloss over things like the lack of investment in council housing. You gloss over the things like further privatisations. You gloss over things like fundamentally embedding Thatcherism in our society and refusing to put proper prudential regulation in place so that you could ride the fucking hot fumes of the financial sector up until the bubble burst, right? There are so many bad things about the Blair administration, in amongst plenty of things that I do agree with, such as things like the Human Rights Act, things like the Equality Act, broadly putting more money back into councils and into welfare that we didn't get otherwise, right? It was true welfare capitalism. And whilst I will happily accept the welfare bit, I think the capitalism bit is bad, regardless, right? Fundamentally, if your appraisal of the Blair years it was all good apart from the Iraq War, you don't know what you're fucking talking about. You just don't know what you're talking about. The stuff about the glasses and the dresses is obviously it's not great, right? But the really bad part was the fact that Wahid Ali managed to essentially buy himself a number 10 pass. We had people who were donating six-figure sums to the Labour Party who miraculously became Labour candidates at the general election. We don't really have any information other than the fact they became a candidate and it was basically a foregone conclusion in the selection. Other than that, to show that it was essentially them buying their slot as a candidate. But it certainly looks that way. It certainly does look that that was the case. And then we get to the Quadrilateral Capital donation, right?
This is damaging. This is so damaging. And I think, and I'm not someone that usually jumps to conclusions, but I think he has potentially one more kind of mistake in him, and then that's it. He's walking on eggshells now, and he is carrying the vase, and the vase is starting to wobble.
This is brilliant. Thank you so much, because you remind me that there comes a point when it doesn't matter what you do. I think Badenoch's crossed that point, actually, despite her very good performance this week at PMQs. It comes a point where it doesn't matter what you do, the damage is terminal. And I think you're right. I don't think he is actually quite there yet, but he's a hell of a lot closer than you or I thought he would be in September of 2025.
Yeah, and the worrying point for a lot of people who maybe lent Labour their vote last year, or who are traditional Labour supporters, is there are very few people in that cabinet or backbench MPs that scream out leader, and I think a caller mentioned maybe before about charisma.
Yes.
Charisma was not an issue during the election campaign, because a lot of people thought, well, he's okay, he's a safe pair of hands. We don't.
And this is it. This is fundamentally 90% of the reason fucking huge amounts of people voted for him. They didn't understand all of the policy. They didn't understand any of what he actually said he was going to do. They just saw this guy is not a Tory, he's a safe pair of hands, he's sensible, centrist, adults in the room, grown-up politics, let's vote for him. That's it. That's the only heuristic they had, chat. That's everything that Literally. Oh, dear Lord. Again, they're like dogs. They understand tone, but not substance.
Want politicians, mired in sleaze and scandal. This is, and it leaves.
That was the trade-off. That's another brilliant point. You're very good at this. Do call me again soon. Thank you.
Wow, I can't believe James agrees with this person and then says how good they are.
Factory, because that was the whole point about having someone dull in the post, is that you would avoid self-inflicted damage, generally, and specific examples of stupidity subjectively, and he hasn't. So what is the point of having a dull and uninspiring leader, regardless of what his skill set may be privately, if that doesn't deliver dull news cycles? Nothing to see here news cycles. What is the point of saying it doesn't? I don't want pizzazz and stardust and fireworks. I want a dull prime minister. I'm speaking personally now. This is James.
I want a prime minister with good policy. Can we talk about the policy, please? Can we talk about the reality of the kind of policy prescriptions that we all want to see, rather than just, I would like this certain fucking genre of prime minister? Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.